Hey everyone, and welcome to another video where we discuss logical fallacies in regards to fictional power scaling. But today, we're mainly going to be talking about appeal to reality. As I talked about in a previous video, I was considering talking about it in a group of 4 other logical fallacies, but honestly, there's so much more that could be discussed and talked about in regards to this particular fallacy that it definitely deserves its own video. Because not only will learning about what an appeal to reality actually is will help you prevent yourself from committing it yourself, but also it's a good starter for how to explain how we power scale fiction in general. Like when it's actually appropriate to base stuff off of reality and when we shouldn't. Now without further ado, let's get into it. So what is an appeal to reality? Ultimately, it is when someone is making the assertion that because something is impossible or isn't possible to exist in reality, therefore it can't exist within the realm of fiction. In other words, it's using what is true in reality to limit what is possible in fiction. Now, in order to properly explain and understand when an argument is based in an appeal to reality, we must go over what is necessary in order to properly analyze a fictional world. Now, even in reality, everything we do or think is all based on assumptions. Assumptions are essentially things that we accept to be true or certain to happen without the need for evidence. And we make assumptions practically all the time. Like if I said, I just made some cookies. You would make an assumption that I'm telling the truth and come over. Or even when I say that, I would be saying that because I've already made the assumption that you would understand the sentence to begin with. Or hell, talking to someone using English would mean you have already made the assumption that they would understand English. We make assumptions all the time. It's second nature to us. But a lot of these assumptions we make are most often based on something that either we have been told or experienced. For example, most of us would have never known that this huge yellow ball of light in the sky was a celestial body almost entirely composed of helium and hydrogen that we call a star if someone didn't tell us or explore the universe enough to even conclude what it was. Or we wouldn't have known that if an apple had this green furry stuff on it, that it wasn't safe to eat if we either were educated enough that it wasn't, or we decided to find that out ourselves, took a bite out of the apple to experience that truth. Now, when it comes to taking a look at a fictional world, in order to even understand what is even going on to begin with, we have to make assumptions. But as we just learned, our assumptions have to be based off of something in order for it to be even considered a valid assumption. Otherwise, such an assumption would be considered baseless. So, say we're taking a look at a fictional world. Doesn't matter which, because in this context we're reading it or watching it for the first time. If we were to properly analyze it, it would be safe to assume that everything in this fictional universe would work the same way as our reality, unless something occurs that ends up contradicting it. Now, for some it's easy to digest this and say that this is a fair thing to do, but let me explain further on why we should do this for those who are still skeptical. It's like we said, in order to properly take a good look at something, we need a solid foundation to start from, if we want to eventually build a sturdy and well-structured understanding of this thing we're analyzing. If we just start assuming right off the bat that everything will be different in comparison to reality, then we're going to run into more issues, and you would need to make and justify a lot more assumptions in even to make that your foundation. And that's how most stories are made, right? We start from creating a world based in reality and make changes to it along the way. How much different you want to make it in comparison to reality is up to you. But we ultimately should treat every single work of fiction this same way. Until we start noticing these differences, it is safer to assume that everything else is based in reality. This is what we call Occam's razor. That whatever tends to make the least amount of assumptions or is the simpler solution is often the correct solution. For example, if we take a show like the Looney Tunes and we see them handling pieces of plywood, now before we see them do anything with it, would it be safer to assume that the structural integrity of the wood is the same as in real life, as opposed to assuming it's not? Because if it's different, what has been shown to prove that assumption is valid? Again, we haven't seen what this piece of plywood has done to make us even assume that to be the case. it doesn't matter how different the rest of the world of Looney Tunes is in comparison to reality, it would still be considered baseless to assume it would be different than to be the same. And that line of thinking would end up you having to provide proof for a bunch of unknowns since we are saying everything is different. Now, with that being said, what are examples of an appeal to reality? And why would it be considered a fallacious argument? A popular example is when concerning characters that go beyond what is thought to be the limit of speed in reality. In other words, characters going faster than the speed of light. Most often, an appeal to reality would be invoked to deny that such a feat is even possible, because it is impossible for anything in reality that includes mass can even reach the speed of light. Now, there's a lot to point out in why this would be entirely fallacious. While this may be true in reality, we're talking about a fictional world that most often doesn't care about what might be true in reality. If the character isn't doing that, then what are they doing? If they traveled across the observable universe in 5 seconds, what do you call that? Because your only two options here are either explaining through your own interpretation that doesn't conclude they went faster than light, or even worse, you would have to deny that such an instance just didn't happen. Which would only get harder to suggest that that is the case the more prevalent the feat is to the plot, or especially if they start performing similar feats more often, making it more consistent. It would end up being more and more work to suggest that these characters going faster than light isn't the conclusion to reach. Especially if the basis to that belief is because such a feat isn't possible for someone in reality. And think about it, if that is your basis for how we should look at fiction, there are a lot more absurd things fictional characters are capable of that you would either have to prove that what happened isn't the case, or just straight up denying that such an event took place, such as characters destroying planets, magic is existing, humans having the ability to fly, read or control minds of others, animals capable of understanding and speaking fluent English, and so much more. None of these things are true in reality, so where's the alternative explanation for all these things? That is one of the strongest ways to attack this illogically based argument, as by presenting what is called a consistency check, in which you test your opponent and how consistent they can remain with their own line of reasoning. For example, say your opponent is using an appeal to reality to discredit the possibility that Goku is faster than light. You can start suggesting other abilities that characters have within other realms of fiction that they agree they have. Then question them on why it is suddenly more reasonable to believe someone is capable of doing that, even though such creatures in reality don't exist. Like, you can even ask them if a story can include creatures such as superhumans, anthropomorphic animals, or even magic users. Because ultimately, that is just as absurd to believe exists, let alone possible to exist within reality without proof. And you can continue to do this until they either realize what believing in an appeal to reality entails, or they end up agreeing to the massively absurd claims and say that anything that isn't possible in reality can happen in fiction. Can you see how this would be incredibly limiting in telling any fictional story? Here's another good example. Fictional horror stories portraying sharks as man-eating machines. Does that mean I could just say that because it doesn't act like a shark in real life, that it isn't a shark at all? Or that the shark is ultimately not even there and the characters are inexcusably being killed off by entities that we don't even know are real? Like, they have to have died from something, but we don't know. It's definitely not a shark because it doesn't act like one in the real life would. There is so much that you can point out about this line of reasoning that is incredibly flawed. Then it's embarrassing whenever I hear people that still make those types of arguments where it's at the base of it. And unless there is legitimately something that doesn't have enough evidence to make it not an unknown, then we can't just say we don't know what the creature is since it's not entirely based in reality. In conclusion, it is entirely valid to assume whenever you're learning about another fictional world, to first assume that everything within said fictional world works the same way as our reality until proven otherwise, and to assume that nothing in fiction can perform feats beyond the bonds of our own reality is almost entirely fallacious, and would end up only creating more holes and not even trying to fill them up with our own interpretations of the story. Well, anyway, that's it for the video. I hope you all enjoyed it. Stay tuned to the end of the video to view what's coming up this Friday. But until then, thank you all for watching, and class is dismissed.